The Montana Territory, 1878. A time when the West was still wild and unforgiving, when survival depended on strength, courage, and sometimes the kindness of strangers. This is the remarkable story of Sarah Caldwell, a schoolteacher turned desperate widow who faced death in the frozen wilderness while protecting her 4 infant children, and of Nahuel Rivers, a solitary Apache tracker whose own tragic past led him to her cabin door on the coldest night of the year. 2 broken souls, brought together by circumstance and the howling winds of a merciless winter, who would forge an unbreakable bond in the face of nature's cruelest test. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blizzard descended upon the Montana Territory like God's own fury, blanketing the rugged landscape in blinding white. 3 feet of snow had fallen in a single day, with more piling up by the hour as the wind screamed across the frontier. 40 miles from the nearest settlement, a small cabin stood half-buried in snowdrifts, its timber frame groaning under the weight of winter's assault. Inside, Sarah Caldwell huddled near the dying embers of what had once been a roaring fire, her thin cotton dress providing little protection against the biting cold. Her golden-brown hair hung limp around hollow cheeks, and dark circles shadowed eyes that had once sparkled with intelligence and warmth. At 26, she looked a decade older, worn down by grief and desperation. "Hush now," she whispered, though her voice cracked from disuse. In her arms, she cradled 2 of her 4 babies, Sophie and Daniel, the youngest of 2 sets of twins born just 8 months apart. Their tiny bodies felt too light against her chest, their breathing shallow. In the makeshift crib nearby, Emma and Levi whimpered weakly, their faces flushed with fever despite the cold. Sarah rocked gently in the chair her husband James had crafted during happier times, when his promises of prosperity on the frontier had still seemed possible. The steady creak of wood against the floorboard marked time like a metronome, counting down hours that might be their last. 27 days. That's how long James had been gone. 27 days since he'd mounted their last horse and ridden toward Black Ridge, promising to return with a doctor for the children and supplies to last the winter. "I'll be back before nightfall," he'd said, planting a distracted kiss on her forehead before stepping into the swirling snow. Sarah shifted Daniel to her other arm, her muscles aching with fatigue. She hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch. Since James left, constantly vigilant for any sign of the children worsening, the pantry held nothing but a handful of withered potatoes and less than a cup of cornmeal. The last of the firewood would be gone by morning. "We're going to be fine," she murmured, though she no longer believed it herself. The babies didn't cry much anymore, a sign she knew boded ill. Even little Sophie, usually the most vocal, merely whimpered now, too weak for proper tears. Outside, the wind changed direction, sending a blast of snow through the gaps in the cabin walls. Sarah shivered violently, tucking the threadbare blanket more tightly around the infants. Before the frontier, before James, Sarah had been a respected schoolteacher in Philadelphia. She'd worn pressed dresses and read poetry to wide-eyed children, in a schoolhouse with glass windows and a proper stove. She'd had suitors, sensible men with steady professions, but none had made her heart race like James Caldwell, with his wild stories of Western adventures and dreams of building an empire from untamed land. "You have spirit," he'd told her. During their courtship, his blue eyes twinkling with admiration. "Most ladies would faint at the thought of frontier life, but not you." Sarah laughed bitterly at the memory. How naive she'd been. How utterly unprepared for the realities of homesteading, the backbreaking labor, the isolation, the constant fear. They'd arrived in Montana in early spring 2 years ago, James beaming with pride as he showed her the land his uncle had left. Him, 100 acres of rugged beauty with a small, sturdy cabin already built near a creek. It had seemed like a dream then, standing hand in hand as they watched the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. James had worked hard that first year. She couldn't deny that. He'd cleared fields for planting, repaired the cabin roof, hunted game to fill their smokehouse. But when Sarah told him she was expecting, his enthusiasm dimmed. And when the midwife confirmed she carried twins, something in him changed. 2 mouths instead of 1, he'd muttered, taking a long pull from his whiskey bottle. He'd been drinking more by then, disappearing for days to the rough settlement of Black Ridge, returning with empty pockets and hollow promises. When the first twins, Emma and Levi, arrived during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin's foundation, James had paced outside like a caged animal, unwilling to witness the bloody battle that brought his children into the world. Sarah placed Daniel back in the crib and moved to the window, scraping frost from the single pane of glass with her fingernail. The landscape outside was alien, transformed by snow into something both beautiful and terrifying. Even if James had intended to return, no man could navigate such conditions. Not alive, anyway. The second pregnancy had been a shock, coming when Emma and Levi were barely 3 months old. The midwife had clucked her tongue disapprovingly, but Sarah had nowhere to direct her shame. By then, James was gone more often than not, returning only when funds ran dry or winter drove him home. "More babies?" he'd shouted when she told him, his face contorted with anger. "We can barely feed the ones we have." Sarah had weathered his rage silently, one hand protectively covering her growing belly. She'd learned by then that arguments only fueled his temper, that quiet endurance was her only defense. Sophie and Daniel had arrived during the first snowfall of this endless winter, tiny and frail, but clinging tenaciously to life. James had been present this time, hovering awkwardly in the cabin's corner while the midwife, Mrs. Jenkins, from 10 miles downriver, efficiently managed the delivery. 4 babies before your 2nd anniversary, Mrs. Jenkins had remarked afterward, helping Sarah clean the newborns. God has blessed you abundantly, though perhaps not wisely. James had left 3 days later, muttering about cabin fever and needing supplies. He'd returned a week after that, with barely enough provisions to last a month, then departed again, when the twins' crying grew too persistent. Each time, his absences grew longer. Each time, his promises rang more hollow. This last time, though, had been different. The children had fallen ill, with fevers that refused to break. Even James, self-absorbed as he was, couldn't ignore their labored breathing and pitiful cries. "I'll fetch Dr. Collins," he'd promised, his expression genuinely concerned for once. "And more medicine, food too. We'll get through this, Sarah." For a brief moment she'd glimpsed the man she'd married, decisive, capable, caring. She'd allowed herself to hope, watching from the doorway as he rode into the swirling snow. 27 days ago. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Sarah snapped back to the present, hurrying to salvage what little heat remained. She knelt before the hearth, arranging the last few sticks to maximize their burning time. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, saving every morsel for the children. "Please," she whispered, though she no longer knew who she was addressing. God, James, or simply the unfeeling wilderness beyond her door. "Please help us." As if in answer, the wind rose to a deafening howl, rattling the cabin's very foundation. Something thumped against the outer wall, probably a branch torn from a nearby pine. Sarah sat back on her heels, a strange calm settling over her. Perhaps this was how it ended, not with a heroic battle against the elements, but with quiet resignation as the cold slowly claimed them. She returned to the crib, gathering all. 4 babies into the main bed instead. If these were to be their final hours, she would hold them close, give them what warmth her body still possessed. She arranged them carefully on the straw mattress. First Levi, the largest and strongest, then Emma beside him, then the younger twins, Sophie and Daniel, their tiny bodies barely displacing the blankets. Sarah slipped in beside them, drawing the quilts up to create a cocoon of fabric. The babies stirred slightly, instinctively curling toward her warmth. Outside, the storm raged with renewed vigor, snow accumulating so rapidly that the single window now showed nothing but white. "I'll tell you a story," she murmured, though the children were too young to understand. Her voice was the only weapon. She had left against the encroaching silence. Once there was a brave princess who lived in a crystal palace by the sea. The fairy tale was one she'd told countless times to her pupils in Philadelphia, a story of courage and perseverance. Her voice gained strength as she continued, painting pictures of fantastic creatures and daring adventures. For a few precious moments, the cold receded, the hunger abated, and the cabin transformed into something magical. When she finished, Emma's tiny hand had found her finger, grasping it with surprising strength. Sarah smiled through sudden tears. "That's right," she whispered. "Hold on, just hold on." She must have dozed briefly, exhaustion finally claiming her, because the sound that woke her came as a shock. Not the wind, not the babies, but a distinct scraping against the cabin door. Sarah froze, listening intently. There it was again. A deliberate human. Hope and terror flooded her simultaneously. James, a neighbor, or something worse. The frontier attracted desperate men, outlaws and deserters, who wouldn't hesitate to take advantage of a woman alone. The scraping continued, followed by a solid thump. Someone was clearing snow from the entrance. Sarah eased away from the sleeping children and slid from the bed. Her legs nearly buckled, weak from hunger and disuse. She steadied herself against the rough wooden wall, heart pounding. The rifle hung above the mantel, loaded but untouched since James's departure. She reached for it with trembling hands. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. She swallowed hard and tried again. "State your business." The movement outside paused briefly, then resumed with greater urgency. Wood groaned as pressure was applied to the door, snow giving way in chunks that thudded against the porch. Sarah raised the rifle, pointing it shakily at the entrance. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, though she knew her chances of hitting anything in her weakened state were slim. With a final heave, the door swung partially open, snow cascading inward across the threshold. A figure stood silhouetted against the white storm. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in what appeared to be animal hides. Not James. Definitely not James. The stranger paused, making no move to enter uninvited. His face remained in shadow, but Sarah could feel his eyes assessing the cabin's interior, taking in her desperate condition, the sleeping children, the dying fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Stay back," Sarah warned, trying to keep the rifle steady. "I'll shoot if I must." The figure raised his hands slowly, showing empty palms. When he spoke, his voice was deep, accented but gentle. "I mean no harm," he said simply. "Saw your smoke. Thought someone might need help." He stepped slightly forward, into the faint glow of the embers, and Sarah gasped. His features were striking. High cheekbones, copper skin, black hair pulled back in a single braid that disappeared into his fur collar. Apache, or perhaps Lakota. His dark eyes held hers steadily without threat or pity. "May I come in?" he asked. "Storm's getting worse." Sarah hesitated, the rifle still raised. Indians weren't uncommon in the territory, but they rarely approached. Settler cabins without reason. Her mind raced through terrible possibilities. Was he alone? Was this a trap? As if reading her thoughts, he gestured behind him. "Just me and my horse. We can go if you prefer." The sincerity in his voice made her waver, that and the realization that if he meant harm, her feeble resistance would make little difference. "Do you have food?" she asked bluntly, lowering the rifle slightly. The faintest smile touched his lips. He reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something wrapped in cloth, offering it cautiously. "Jerky," he said. "Deer. Dried berries, too." Sarah's resolve crumbled at the sight of food. She lowered the rifle completely. "Come in," she said, stepping back. "Please." He entered with the quiet grace of a natural hunter, bringing with him a blast of cold air and the scent of pine and wood smoke. Snow clung to his buckskin leggings, and the fur cape draped across his shoulders. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting against harsh sun and wind. "Thank you," he said, closing the door firmly behind him. He stamped, his feet lightly to remove excess snow, then stood still, allowing her to maintain a comfortable distance. "I'm Sarah," she offered, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. "Sarah Caldwell." He nodded once. "Nahuel Rivers. An unusual name. Part native, part American. Like him, she supposed. "The children," he said, glancing toward the bed where the 4 babies lay huddled together. "They're sick." Sarah nodded, grief tightening her throat. "Fever. My husband went for medicine 27 days ago." Understanding dawned in Nahuel's dark eyes. In the territory, an absence that long during winter told its own story. Without comment, he moved to the fireplace, kneeling to examine the pitiful remains of her fire. From inside his coat he produced a small bundle of tightly bound kindling and several larger pieces of split pine. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the hearth. "Please," Sarah whispered, overwhelmed by this simple kindness. His hands worked quickly, efficiently, building a small teepee of kindling around the dying embers. He blew gently, coaxing the spark back to flame, then gradually added larger pieces. Within minutes, warmth began to radiate outward again. "Eat," he said, offering the wrapped package once more. "Small bites, slow." Sarah took the food with shaking hands, forcing herself to nibble at the jerky rather than devour it. The flavor exploded on her tongue. Rich, smoky, life-giving. She closed her eyes briefly in gratitude. When she opened them, Nahuel had moved. To the children's bedside. He stood respectfully distant, observing but not touching. "How long have they been sick?" he asked quietly. "The older ones, almost a month," Sarah replied between careful bites. "The younger ones, about 2 weeks. They're twins, both sets. Emma and Levi are 10 months. Sophie and Daniel are just 2 months old." Nahuel's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise at her situation. "My horse is outside," he said. "I have medicines, herbs, might help." Hope flickered in Sarah's chest for the first time in weeks. "You're a healer." "I know some ways," he replied modestly. "Learned from my mother and from living alone." Sarah nodded, suddenly desperate for his help, this stranger who had appeared like a vision through the storm. "Please," she said, "anything you can do." As Nahuel turned toward the door, a particularly violent gust shook the cabin, sending a shower of snow down the chimney. The fire hissed in protest. "I'll check the roof too," he said, surveying the ceiling. "Won't last the night otherwise." With that, he stepped back into the howling whiteness, leaving Sarah clutching the precious food, staring at the partially closed door. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she had hallucinated him. This quiet savior appearing at her darkest hour. But then he returned, snow swirling around his substantial frame, arms laden with supplies from his saddlebags, leather pouches, a worn blanket, a small iron pot. He worked methodically, boiling water for a medicinal tea, preparing poultices for the children's chests, reinforcing the fire until the cabin grew properly warm for the first time in days. He spoke little, but his presence filled the small space. not intruding but complementing, like the final piece of a puzzle clicked into place. As the blizzard raged outside, transforming the world into an unrecognizable wasteland, something shifted within the cabin's walls. Not safety, not yet, but the faintest glimmer of possibility, where before there had been only resignation. Sarah watched Nahuel's careful movements as he tended to her children, his strong hands impossibly gentle as he applied a sweetly pungent salve to their congested chests. In the growing firelight, she noticed a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, old and faded, but significant. She wondered what story it told, what hardships this man had endured before finding his way to her door. For the first time in 27 days, Sarah allowed herself to exhale fully. Tomorrow remained uncertain, survival was not guaranteed, but tonight at least they were not alone. Dawn broke reluctantly over the Montana wilderness, the sun a pale smudge behind clouds heavy with fresh snow. The blizzard had subsided to a steady fall, blanketing the land in hushed white. Inside the cabin, Sarah woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar warmth surrounding her. The fire still burned strong in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The children slept peacefully beside her, their breathing easier than it had been in weeks. And there, seated on the floor with his back against the wall, was the stranger, Nahuel Rivers, his eyes closed but his posture alert, as if resting, rather than truly sleeping. Sarah shifted slightly, and his eyes opened immediately, dark and watchful. For a moment, they simply regarded each other across the small space, measuring, assessing. "The fever's broken in the older ones," he said, quietly nodding toward Emma and Levi. "The little ones will take longer." Sarah placed a gentle hand on each child's forehead, confirming his observation with a surge of relief. "How did you know what to give them?" Nahuel's expression remained impassive, but something softened in his gaze. "The tea is elderberry and willow bark, the salve, pine resin, and beaver oil. Old ways." He paused, then added, "My people used them for generations." Sarah nodded, absorbing this information. In her desperation, she hadn't questioned his methods the night before, but daylight brought caution. "You're Apache?" "My mother was," he replied, rising fluidly to check the fire. "My father was a cavalry scout from Kentucky, James Rivers." He spoke the name without emotion, a simple fact rather than a point of pride or shame. "And Nahuel?" Sarah asked, curious despite herself. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "My mother's choice. It means jaguar in her language." He moved to the window, clearing a small circle in the frost to peer outside. "Storm's easing. I should check the horse. Bring in more wood." Sarah noticed he hadn't asked about her husband, about why she was alone with 4 infants in the middle of nowhere with dwindling supplies. The omission felt deliberate, a courtesy she appreciated. "Thank you," she said, the words wholly inadequate, "for stopping, for helping us." Nahuel turned from the window, studying her with those unfathomable eyes. "No one should face the winter alone," he said simply, then wrapped his fur cape around his shoulders and stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, leaving Sarah to wonder about the story behind his words. She moved carefully around the sleeping children to rebuild her strength, washing her face with melted snow, combing her tangled hair with her fingers, changing into her last clean dress, a faded blue calico worn thin at the elbows. By the time Nahuel returned, arms laden with firewood, Sarah had managed to heat water for coffee, stretched thin from repeated use of the grounds, but hot and comforting nonetheless. "I made breakfast," she offered, gesturing to the table where she'd placed 2 steaming cups and a small portion of the cornmeal, cooked into a simple mush. "It's not much." "It's good," he interrupted, setting the wood beside the hearth. "Thank you." They ate in silence, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional pop from the fire and the soft breathing of the children. Sarah found herself studying his movements, economical, precise, like a man accustomed to conserving energy. His hands were calloused but clean, his buckskins worn but well-maintained. Despite his imposing size, he moved with a deliberate gentleness, as if constantly aware of his impact on the space around him. "You track for the army?" she asked finally, nodding toward the weathered cavalry knife sheathed at his belt. Nahuel shook his head. "Used to, now I hunt, trap sometimes, guide when someone needs finding." He took a careful sip of coffee. "Or when someone's lost." The statement hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah looked away, uncomfortable under his perceptive gaze. "We're not lost," she said defensively. "This is our homestead, my husband's land." Nahuel didn't contradict her, but something in his silence conveyed skepticism. "He's coming back," Sarah insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. He struggles with the responsibility sometimes. 4 babies are a lot to handle." "Yes," Nahuel agreed mildly. "They are." A cry from the bed interrupted their conversation, Sophie awakening hungry and uncomfortable. Sarah moved quickly to tend to her, lifting the feverish infant with practiced ease. "The younger ones need milk," Nahuel observed, watching as Sarah attempted to nurse the increasingly agitated baby. "You don't have enough." The blunt assessment stung, but Sarah couldn't deny its truth. Her milk had been diminishing for days, her own body too undernourished to provide adequately for 4 infants. "I've been watering down what little cow's milk we had left," she admitted, "but it ran out 3 days ago." Nahuel considered this problem, his brow furrowed. "There's a trading post at Eagle Crossing, 20 miles east. They might have tinned milk." Sarah's heart sank. 20 miles in this snow? Impossible. "Not impossible," he countered. "Difficult, but possible with snowshoes and a strong horse." Hope flared briefly in Sarah's chest, then dimmed. "Even if you could make it there and back, I have no money, nothing to trade." Nahuel rose from the table, gathering his few belongings without responding to her concern. "I'll go today. Be back by tomorrow night if the weather holds." "But—" Sarah began to protest. "The children need milk," he stated firmly, "and more medicine. Your roof needs proper patching. The north wall has gaps that need sealing before the next storm." He listed these facts without judgment, merely outlining the reality of their situation. Sarah felt shame flood her cheeks. Everything he said was true. The cabin was in desperate need of repairs that she lacked the strength or knowledge to perform. James had always promised to fix things next week, or once the harvest was in. Promises that evaporated like morning. "I can't ask you to do all that," she said quietly. "You've already done more than enough for strangers." Nahuel paused in his preparations, regarding her thoughtfully. "My mother taught me that there are no strangers in a storm, only people who haven't shared fire yet." He secured his knife more firmly to his belt. "We've shared fire. Now we share a purpose." With that simple declaration, he knelt beside the bed to examine the children once more. His large hand gently cradled each small head, checking for fever, his expression softening imperceptibly as tiny fingers reflexively grasped his thumb. "Give them this tea every few hours," he instructed, pointing to a small pouch he'd left by the hearth. "Just a spoonful for the little ones, more for the older too. It will help with the fever and coughing." Sarah nodded, committing his instructions to memory. "How do I repay you for all this?" Nahuel looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "You already have," he said, gesturing to the empty coffee cup. "Breakfast was good." Before she could formulate a response, he had donned his fur cape and moved to the door. "Bar this behind me," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Don't open for anyone until I return." "How will I know it's you?" Sarah asked, suddenly anxious. At the thought of being alone again, despite having managed for nearly a month, Nahuel considered this, then reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a small carved figure, a horse, its lines simple but elegant. He pressed it into her palm. "I'll ask for this when I return. No one else knows of it." Sarah closed her fingers around the wooden horse, oddly comforted by its solid presence. "Be careful," she said, surprising herself with the depth of concern in her voice. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "Always am." After he left, Sarah stood at the window for a long time, watching his tall figure move through the snow with remarkable speed, a pack on his back, and what appeared to be wooden frames strapped to his feet, the snowshoes he'd mentioned. His horse, a sturdy Mustang with a shaggy winter coat, followed obediently on a long lead. When he disappeared into the tree line, Sarah felt a momentary panic. What if he didn't come back? What if this brief respite of hope was just another cruel trick of fate? She looked down at the carved horse in her hand, running her thumb over its smooth surface. Something about its solidity reassured her. A man who created something this beautiful, this precise, was a man who kept his word. The day passed slowly. Sarah divided her time between tending to the children, whose conditions continued to improve under Nahuel's medicine, and attempting to address the cabin's most pressing needs. She stuffed rags into the worst gaps in the north wall, using the last of her petticoat as insulation. She cleared snow from the threshold and reinforced the bar across the door. Each task exhausted her weakened body, but Sarah pushed through, drawing strength from the knowledge that she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Someone was coming back. Someone was bringing help. By nightfall, all 4 children were awake and alert enough to take small amounts of the medicinal tea. Even Sophie, the frailest, showed signs of improvement, her tiny fist batting the air with newfound energy. Sarah sang to them as darkness fell, old Philadelphia schoolroom songs and half-remembered lullabies from her own childhood. "Your father isn't coming back, is he?" she whispered to the babies as they drifted to sleep. It was the first time she'd voiced the truth aloud, and strangely, it didn't bring the wave of despair she'd expected. Instead, she felt a curious lightening, as if naming the abandonment had somehow diminished its power over her. That night, Sarah dreamed of her classroom in Philadelphia, sunlight streaming through tall windows, children's voices raised in recitation, the comforting smell of chalk and polished wood. In the dream, she looked up to find Nahuel standing in the doorway, out of place in his buckskins and moccasins, yet somehow belonging exactly where he was. She woke before dawn, the cabin still dark save for the glow of banked coals. The dream lingered, leaving her with a sense of disquiet she couldn't quite name. Sarah stoked the fire with careful precision, conserving the wood Nahuel had gathered, trying not to think about how quickly it could disappear if he didn't return. The second day of his absence crawled by, each hour stretching impossibly long. Sarah rationed the last of their food, a handful of dried beans and the remaining cornmeal, with mathematical precision. She boiled snow for drinking water and washing, maintaining the cleanliness that had been ingrained in her since childhood. By late afternoon, the weather had turned again, clouds gathering ominously on the western horizon. Sarah stood at the window, the carved horse clutched in her palm like a talisman, watching the approach of another storm with mounting dread. "Please," she whispered, though whether to God or to Nahuel himself she couldn't say. "Please come back before it hits." As if in answer, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a dark shape moving against the whiteness, still distant, but unmistakably human. Sarah's heart leapt, then immediately contracted with caution. It could be anyone, a stranger, a threat. She reached for the rifle, keeping it ready as she continued to watch the approaching figure. The heavy cloud cover made it difficult to see clearly, But as the person drew nearer, she recognized the distinctive gait, the broad shoulders, the fur cape now heavily laden with snow. Nahuel. Relief coursed through her so strongly that her knees nearly buckled. Sarah set the rifle aside and moved to unbar the door, then hesitated, remembering his instructions. She waited until his knock came, 3 firm raps against the wood. "Who's there?" she called, following the protocol of safety, even though her heart sang with recognition. "Nahuel Rivers," came the steady reply. "I've come for my horse." Sarah opened the door, the wooden carving extended in her palm as proof of his identity. Nahuel's features, half hidden beneath a snow-crusted fur hood, relaxed visibly at the sight of her. Behind him stood his Mustang, sides heaving from exertion, pulling a makeshift travois laden with supplies. "You made it," Sarah breathed, stepping back to allow him entry. "I was beginning to worry." "Storm's coming," he said simply, stomping snow from his boots. "Had to push hard on the return." He looked exhausted, his normally impassive face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes were clear and focused as they swept the cabin, checking first on the children, then on the fire, then on Sarah herself. "You look better," he observed, removing his heavy outer layer. "Stronger." Sarah hadn't considered her own appearance, but realized he was right. Purpose had restored something vital within her, a spark of the determination that had once led her to accept a teaching position at just 19, that had given her the courage to leave Philadelphia for the unknown West. "The children are better." "Too," she reported. "The tea worked. Even Sophie took some broth I made from the last bone." Nahuel nodded, satisfied. "Good. I brought supplies." He gestured toward the door. "Need to get it inside before the storm hits." Together they unloaded the travois, a task that would have been impossible for Sarah alone just days ago. The bounty seemed miraculous. Sacks of flour and beans, coffee, sugar, salt pork, 2 precious tins of condensed milk, candles, matches, a bundle of sturdy cloth, nails, tools, and most surprisingly, a small crate of apples. "Apples?" Sarah questioned, holding one up with something approaching wonder. "How did you get fresh apples in winter?" "Trading post keeper's wife preserves them in sand barrels," Nahuel explained, arranging firewood near the hearth. "Good for the children. Vitamins." The casual knowledge surprised her. "You know about vitamins?" A shadow passed across his face. "Army doctor taught me. When I was scouting." He didn't elaborate, but Sarah sensed there was more to that story, perhaps connected to the scar that traced his jawline. As they organized the supplies, Sarah noticed something else. Nahuel moved with a slight stiffness, favoring his left side, in a way he hadn't before. "You're hurt," she said, pausing in her work. Nahuel shrugged dismissively. "Ice broke under the horse halfway back. Had to pull him out, nothing serious." But when he reached overhead to place a bag on a high shelf, Sarah caught his wince. "Let me see," she insisted, her teacher's voice emerging unbidden. To her surprise, Nahuel acquiesced without argument, sitting on the edge of the single chair and allowing her to examine his side. When she lifted his buckskin shirt, she inhaled sharply at the deep bruising spread across his ribs. "This isn't nothing," she scolded, probing gently with practiced fingers. "You could have broken ribs." "Not broken," he countered. "Just bruised. Had worse." Sarah frowned, recognizing the stubborn set of his jaw. "At least let me wrap them. I have clean strips from my old petticoat." As she worked, binding his torso with firm but gentle pressure, Sarah became acutely aware of their physical proximity. Nahuel's skin was warm beneath her fingers, his breathing controlled and steady despite what must have been considerable pain. Old scars marked his copper flesh, testament to a hard life lived without complaint. "You risked a lot," she said quietly, securing the final knot. "For people you don't even know." Nahuel's dark eyes met hers, unexpectedly vulnerable in the fading light. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're brave. I know you love your children. I know you didn't give up when it would have been easier." His simple assessment touched something deep within Sarah, a recognition of her own strength that had been buried beneath months of struggle and disappointment. Before she could respond, Emma began to cry, her tiny voice piercing the intimate moment. Nahuel drew his shirt back down, the connection between them receding, but not disappearing entirely. "She's hungry," he said, rising carefully. "I'll heat a water for the milk." As he moved about the cabin with newfound familiarity, preparing bottles from the tinned milk he'd brought, Sarah watched him with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Why was this solitary man, clearly accustomed to answering to no one, investing so much in their survival? "Nahuel," she ventured, after the children were fed and settled, "why did you really stop that first night? You could have kept going, found shelter elsewhere." He was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent. "8 winters ago, I was tracking for the army when a blizzard hit. Got separated from the patrol. Horse broke his leg in a drift." He stared into the fire, eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I was 3 days without shelter, without food. Started to see things that weren't there." Sarah listened intently, sensing the importance of this rare confidence. "On the 4th day, I found a cave. Inside was an old Blackfoot woman, blind, living alone. She should have killed me. I was wearing cavalry scout clothes, and her people had suffered greatly at soldiers' hands." Nahuel's expression softened the memory. "Instead, she shared her fire, shared her food, told me that any man can fight, but only the truly strong can show mercy." He looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze directly. "When I saw your smoke, I remembered her, remembered that debt." Sarah understood then. It wasn't charity he offered, but reciprocity, the balancing of an ancient scale. "Did you ever see her again?" she asked. "The Blackfoot woman?" Sadness flickered across Nahuel's face. "Went back the next summer to thank her properly. Found the cave empty except for burial stones. The wind howled suddenly against the cabin, the approaching storm announcing itself with a banshee wail. Nahuel rose to check the door's security, his movements careful but determined despite his injury. "This storm will last 3 days," he said, peering through the window at the darkening sky. "Maybe 4. Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety. "Will our supplies last?" Nahuel turned to her, and for the first time since their meeting, smiled fully. A transformation so complete, it momentarily took her breath away. "Yes, Sarah Caldwell," he said, her name sounding different in his rich, accented voice. "We have everything we need." As the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, obliterating the world beyond their window, Sarah realized that for the first time in months, perhaps years, she believed those words completely. The promised storm unleashed, its fury throughout the night, wind shrieking through the pines and hurling snow against the cabin with such force it seemed determined to bury them entirely. By morning, the single window showed nothing but white, the outside world erased as if it had never existed. Sarah woke to find Nahuel already active, tending the fire with practiced efficiency, a pot of coffee brewing on the small iron stove. The children slept peacefully, their breathing noticeably improved from even the day before. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt herself relax into the moment, accepting this strange domestic tableau with a gratitude that bordered on wonder. "How long have you been awake?" she asked, sitting up and smoothing her hair. Nahuel glanced over, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Since before dawn, needed to check the roof. Snow's heavy." Sarah noticed a small puddle beneath the northeast corner where previously there had been only occasional drips. "Is it holding?" "For now." He poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, offering one to her. "I'll reinforce it today, north wall too." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. "You're in pain," she observed, noting the careful way he moved. Nahuel didn't deny it, but neither did he acknowledge the injury further. Instead, he nodded toward the children. The little girl, Sophie, her fever's nearly gone. The deliberate change of subject didn't escape Sarah's notice, but she allowed it, recognizing a boundary she shouldn't push. "The tea you brought works wonders," she said. "In Philadelphia we would have called Dr. Ellsworth with his smelling salts and leeches." A flicker of amusement crossed Nahuel's face. "Nature provides better medicine than leeches." "You learned from your mother?" Sarah asked, remembering his earlier mention. Nahuel nodded, his expression softening imperceptibly. "She was a healer. Among her people, knew every plant, every root, every bark and its purpose." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "When she married my father, the army wouldn't let her practice, said it was superstition, not medicine." Sarah heard the old hurt beneath his measured words. "But she taught you anyway." "In secret," he confirmed. "Until I was 12. Then the fever took her." The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken grief. Sarah reached across the small space between them, her hand lightly touching his forearm. "I'm sorry." Nahuel looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, something shifting in his dark eyes. "It was a long time ago." "And your father?" Sarah asked gently. "Returned to Kentucky after she died. Took me with him." His mouth tightened. "His people weren't welcoming to a half Apache boy. I left when I was 16, came back west." Before Sarah could respond, Daniel began to fuss, his tiny face scrunching with hunger. The moment of confidence passed as she moved to tend to the baby. But something had changed between them. A door opened that couldn't quite be closed again. The day developed a rhythm unlike any Sarah had experienced since arriving in Montana. While she cared for the children, preparing the diluted milk Nahuel had brought and administering the medicinal tea at regular intervals, he set about repairing the cabin with methodical precision. First, he cleared the roof of its dangerous snow load, working from inside by punching a small hole through the ceiling and using a long pole to dislodge the heaviest drifts. Then he patched the leaking corner with spare boards and pine resin, creating a waterproof seal that immediately stopped the dripping. "Where did you learn to build?" Sarah asked, watching him create shingles from split pine with impressive speed. "Everywhere," he replied simply. "Worked cattle ranches in Wyoming, lumber camp in Oregon, gold fields in Colorado." He fitted a shingle into place with exacting care. Man who can't build can't survive. Sarah thought of James, whose carpentry skills had been limited to crude repairs and half-finished projects. "My husband wasn't much of a builder," she admitted. "He had other talents." Nahuel continued working, his silence an invitation to, elaborate or not, entirely her choice. "He could talk," Sarah said after a moment, surprising herself with the candor. "Talk to anyone into anything. Talked me into leaving a perfectly good teaching position to come to this wilderness. Talked his way out of paying for supplies at the general store. Talked himself into believing he could be a farmer without actually doing the work of farming." She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but once started, the words flowed like a river breaking through ice. "He wasn't always like that. When we met, he was charming, ambitious. He had plans, dreams. I believed in them, in him." Nahuel paused in his work, regarding her thoughtfully. "Dreams without work are just air," he said. The simple assessment so perfectly captured James's fatal flaw that Sarah laughed, a short, surprised sound that startled even her. "Yes, exactly. Just air." Nahuel resumed his repairs, moving to the north wall where the worst gaps allowed cold to seep through. "Your dreams?" he asked, his back to her as he worked. "Were they just air, too?" The question caught Sarah off guard. No one, not even James in their courting days, had ever asked about her dreams. "I wanted to open a proper school someday," she said slowly. "Not just teach in someone else's. A place where any child could learn, regardless of circumstances." She glanced meaningfully at Nahuel, thinking of his story, of a mixed heritage. "Boy unwelcomed in Kentucky society." "Good dream," he said, nodding approval. "Solid. Real." His validation warmed something long cold within her. "It seems impossible now," she said, gesturing to the 4 babies, who represented both her greatest joy and her heaviest constraint. Nahuel turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Winter always seems endless in the middle. But spring comes." The simple wisdom silenced her objections. Sarah nodded, accepting both the metaphor and the underlying message. This hardship was a season, not a permanent condition. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself watching Nahuel with growing fascination. Despite his size and the lingering injury to his ribs, he moved with a grace that spoke of absolute physical confidence. His hands, large and powerful, could perform the most delicate tasks with surprising gentleness, whether cradling Levi's small head to help him drink or securing the finest details of a repair. By midday, the north wall was sealed against the howling wind, the roof patched securely, and the doorframe reinforced with additional supports. The cabin, which had seemed on the verge of surrender to the elements just days ago, now felt solid, defensible against winter's assault. "It's transformed," Sarah marveled, surveying his work. "Like a different place entirely." Nahuel accepted the praise with a simple nod, but she caught the satisfaction in his eyes as he surveyed his handiwork. "Will hold now, through spring." The casualness of the statement, the assumption that they would be there together in spring, hung in the air between them, neither acknowledged nor denied. That afternoon, as the storm continued its relentless barrage, Sarah decided to properly organize the supplies Nahuel had brought. The simple domestic task gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in months. She inventoried everything meticulously, calculating how long each item would last if carefully rationed. "We have enough for 3 weeks," she announced, pleased with her assessment. "Longer if we're careful with the coffee and sugar." Nahuel, who was whittling by the fire, looked up with that ghost of a smile. "Enough time." "For what?" Sarah asked. "For me to hunt when the storm breaks, for the trading post road to clear enough for another trip." He tested the edge of his knife against his thumb. "For the little ones to grow stronger." Sarah was struck, again, by his matter-of-fact confidence. Not bravado or false promises, but the calm assurance of a man who had faced nature's challenges repeatedly and prevailed. "You make it sound simple," she said. "Not simple," he corrected. "Possible." As evening approached, Sarah prepared a more substantial meal than they'd had in weeks. Beans simmered with salt pork, cornbread baked in the small Dutch oven. Nahuel had brought even stewed apples sweetened with a precious spoonful of sugar. The rich aromas filled the cabin, transforming it further into something that felt remarkably like home. They ate companionably, sharing the single table, their knees occasionally brushing in the small space. Sarah found herself talking more freely than she had in years, telling Nahuel about her childhood in western Pennsylvania, her father's work as a newspaper editor, her mother's insistence that she receive a proper education despite limited means. "She saved egg money for 2 years to send me to normal school," Sarah recalled, smiling at the memory. "Told me a woman with a teaching certificate would never go hungry, never be dependent on a man's whims." "Wise woman," Nahuel commented, sopping up the last of his beans with cornbread. Sarah's smile faded. "She would be so disappointed to see me now, abandoned in the wilderness with 4 babies and no means of support." "No," Nahuel said with unexpected firmness. "She would be proud. You kept them alive against impossible odds. You didn't surrender." His certainty silenced her self-recrimination. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to see her situation through his eyes, not as a failure, but as a testament to endurance. "What about you?" she asked, deflecting attention from the emotion tightening her throat. "Where will you go when the weather clears? Back to trapping?" Nahuel set down his spoon, his expression unreadable. "I don't know yet," he said after a pause. Winter's long. The non-answer contained possibilities that Sarah wasn't ready to examine too closely. Instead, she focused on the practical. "Well, you're welcome to shelter here as long as necessary. It's the least I can offer after everything you've done." "Thank you," he said simply, but something in his eyes suggested her casual invitation held more significance than she'd intended. After dinner, as the wind continued to howl and snow pattered against the walls, they established a new routine. Nahuel insisted on sleeping on a bedroll near the door, both to give Sarah privacy with the children and to maintain vigilance against the unlikely event of intruders braving the storm. Sarah tended to the babies, who were growing more active and demanding as their health improved. When all four were finally settled for the night, Sarah found herself unexpectedly restless. The storm's confinement, after weeks of desperate survival, left her mind free to wander paths long neglected. She sat by the fire, mending one of the children's blankets by the flickering light. Nahuel worked quietly nearby, using scraps of wood to create something she couldn't quite discern. The comfortable silence between them felt like a conversation all its own, an acknowledgement that words weren't always necessary. "What are you making?" she finally asked, curiosity overcoming her reticence. He held up his work, a small, intricately carved rattle, smooth and polished, with tiny objects sealed inside that created a gentle sound when shaken. "For the babies," he explained, "to strengthen their grip, help them grow." Sarah was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful." Nahuel shrugged, but looked pleased. "Simple thing. My mother made something similar for the children, in our band." He hesitated, then added, "Had a daughter once who never got to hold one." The revelation landed like a stone in still water. Sarah stilled her needle, waiting. "My wife, Kimmy, died bringing her into the world," Nahuel continued, his voice low, eyes fixed on the carving in his hands. 6 years ago now, winter like this one." "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, understanding now the shadows that sometimes darkened his gaze when he looked at the children. "I was guiding a hunting party, 3 days from camp." His hands tightened on the carving. "When I returned, both were gone, buried under stones." The stark pain in his voice reached across the space between them, familiar and devastating. "That's why you stopped that night," Sarah realized. "Why couldn't you just pass by?" Nahuel nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. No one helped Kimmy. No one could reach her through the snow. His eyes met Sarah's, intense and direct. "I couldn't change her fate, but maybe yours." The honesty of his confession hung in the air between them. Not asked for, not expected, but offered nonetheless. Sarah set aside her mending and moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I'm glad you stopped," she said softly. "Not just because you saved us, because it was right that you were the one to do it." Something shifted in Nahuel's expression, a softening, a recognition. He didn't speak, but his hand moved slightly, until his fingers brushed hers, a fleeting contact that neither acknowledged but both felt with startling intensity. They remained that way for a long time, watching the fires dance, listening to the storm and the gentle breathing of the sleeping children. No further words were necessary. Each had shared a piece of their deepest grief, and in doing so created a connection more profound than casual conversation could achieve. The next morning brought no respite from the storm, but a new crisis emerged. Levi, the strongest of the four, woke with alarming symptoms. His tiny body rigid, face flushed with renewed fever, a strange rash spreading across his chest. "Something's wrong," Sarah called to Nahuel, her voice tight with fear as she lifted the writhing infant. "He was better yesterday. Now look at him." Nahuel approached swiftly, examining the baby with careful hands. His expression remained calm, but Sarah caught the concern in his eyes. "Different sickness," he concluded. "Not the chest fever anymore. Something else." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, panic rising as Levi's small face contorted in obvious pain. Nahuel considered for a moment, then moved decisively to his pack. "I need water boiled, clean cloths, and this." He withdrew a small leather pouch, its contents rattling faintly. While Sarah prepared what he'd requested, Nahuel created a paste from the pouch's contents, a mixture of dried herbs and roots that released a pungent, earthy aroma when crushed. He worked with absolute focus, his movements precise and confident. "What is it?" Sarah asked, watching him measure exact portions with the tip of his knife. "Willow bark for fever, echinacea for infection, elderflower for the rash." He added water to create a paste. "My mother's remedy for scarlet fever," Sarah gasped. "Scarlet fever? But that can be fatal in infants." "Can be," Nahuel agreed, steadily. "But not today, not for him." His certainty calmed her somewhat, though fear still clutched at her heart as she watched him apply the paste to the baby's chest and back, then wrap him in clean cloths. "Now we wait," he said, handing the whimpering child back to Sarah. "Keep him cool, give water often, just drops." Throughout that long day and into the night, they worked together in seamless coordination, taking turns holding Levi, applying fresh paste when needed, bathing his tiny body with cool cloths to combat the raging fever. Sarah watched in awe as Nahuel handled the infant with the assurance of experience, supporting his head just so, murmuring softly in what she assumed was his mother's language. "What are you saying to him?" she asked during one exchange, as Nahuel took the fretful baby from her tired arms. "Old healing song," he replied, his deep voice gentle as he continued the rhythmic chant. "Says that his spirit is strong, that the sickness is just passing through, not staying." Sarah found herself believing it, drawing strength from Nahuel's unwavering confidence. "Do you think he can understand?" "Not the words," Nahuel said, looking down at the infant with an expression that made Sarah's heart twist strangely, "but the intention, the care that reaches beyond understanding." By dawn, the crisis had passed. Levi's fever broke dramatically, his tiny body relaxing into natural sleep for the first time in 24 hours. The rash began to fade, retreating from angry red to pale pink. Sarah collapsed into a chair, exhaustion and relief washing over her in equal measure. "You saved him," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to thank you." Nahuel shook his head, settling the sleeping baby back in the cradle. "You would have found a way," he said with quiet conviction. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah Caldwell." She looked up at him then, this man who had appeared from the wilderness like an answer to an unspoken prayer, who had given so much and asked for nothing in return. In that moment, with the storm still raging outside and her children safe within, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed within her. The paralyzing fear that had been her constant companion since James's departure was gone, replaced by a steadfast resolve. Whatever came next, whatever challenges winter still held, she would face them. Not alone, not anymore. But even if she were alone again someday, she would endure. She would find a way. Nahuel must have read something of these thoughts in her expression, because he nodded once, as if in confirmation of a truth they both recognized. "See," he said softly, "spring always comes." Outside, unnoticed by either of them, the wind had begun to ease. The storm, having spent its fury against their reinforced shelter, was finally breaking. The worst of winter's assault had passed, leaving them changed but undefeated. 3 days after the great storm finally subsided, the world beyond the cabin windows began to reawaken. The sun emerged from behind persistent clouds, casting brilliant light across the transformed landscape. Snow lay in massive drifts, some taller than a man, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes that caught the morning light like polished marble. Sarah stood on the cleared porch, breathing deeply of the crisp, clean air. The children were inside, all four finally on the mend, bundled together in the makeshift playpen Nahuel had constructed from spare lumber. Their babbling voices carried through the partially open door, a chorus of life that no longer seemed fragile, but vital and growing. "Stronger by the day. Beautiful," Nahuel commented, emerging from the small storage shed he'd spent the morning reinforcing. His breath clouded in the frigid air as he came to stand beside her, surveying the glistening expanse. "Deadly beautiful," Sarah amended, remembering all too well how close they'd come to succumbing to winter's magnificence. Nahuel nodded, acknowledging the truth of her assessment. "But we endured it." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. We, not you, not I, but we. Sarah felt the significance of that shift, the comfort it brought, and the complexity it introduced to their situation. "The trading post will be accessible soon," he continued, gesturing toward the east where Eagle Crossing lay. 2, maybe 3 days of sun to clear the main trail. "You'll go again?" Sarah asked, surprised by the pang the question evoked. "We need more supplies," he said practically. "Milk for the babies and—" He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "News." Sarah understood his meaning immediately. News of James. News of whether her husband was truly gone or merely delayed. News that might change everything. "Yes," she agreed quietly. "We need to know." Their eyes met briefly, a current of unspoken understanding passing between them. Whatever bond had formed in the crucible of survival, it existed in suspension, temporary, conditional, dependent on circumstances neither of them controlled. "I'll prepare a list," Sarah said, retreating from the moment and the complicated emotions it stirred. "We should be practical about what we need most." Nahuel nodded, his expression returning to its usual calm attentiveness. "I'll check the west perimeter. First, make sure nothing's been damaged by the weight of snow." As he moved away, picking a careful path through the drifts, Sarah watched him, the straight line of his back, the purposeful stride, the way he constantly assessed his surroundings. In just over a week, his presence had become as essential to her daily existence as air. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Inside, she found the children surprisingly quiet. All four focused intently on the wooden toys Nahuel had carved during the long storm days. Rattles for the younger, twins, small animals for Emma and Levi. Sarah checked each one thoroughly, finding them all properly fed, clean, and contented. The routine she and Nahuel had established was working remarkably well. She sat at the table and began her list, prioritizing necessities over comforts. More tinned milk topped the page, followed by flour, sugar, coffee, and dried meat. Medical supplies came next. Clean bandages, laudanum for emergencies, more of the herbs Nahuel had used so effectively. She hesitated before adding fabric for new baby clothes, thread, and needles. The items felt like an investment in a future she couldn't quite envision yet. The sound of approaching horses broke her concentration, multiple animals moving at speed through the packed snow. Sarah froze, pencil hovering above paper, every sense suddenly alert. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In the aftermath of such a storm, they were unprecedented. She moved quickly to the window, her heart accelerating as she counted 3 riders approaching from the south, the direction of Black Ridge, not Eagle Crossing. Their postures were rigid, purposeful, Nothing like the casual bearing of neighbors checking on welfare after a storm. Without hesitation, Sarah gathered all 4 babies into the large cradle, tucking blankets securely around them. She reached for the rifle above the mantel, checking that it was loaded, then positioned herself near the window where she could observe without being easily seen. The riders drew closer, details emerging with each yard gained. The leader was a large man with a full beard and expensive-looking coat, not a local farmer or trapper. Behind him rode 2 rougher-looking men, each armed with rifles resting casually across their saddles. Their horses were quality stock, well-fed and groomed, not the hardy but often scraggly mounts most frontier settlers managed. Sarah's mouth went dry. She glanced toward the west property line where Nahuel had disappeared, but saw no sign of him. Whatever this situation was, she would face it alone, at least initially. The lead rider reined in about 20 yards from the cabin, raising a hand to halt his companions. He surveyed the property with obvious interest, his gaze lingering on the repaired roof, the cleared path to the door, the smoke rising steadily from the chimney. After a moment, he dismounted and approached alone, his manner confident but not overtly threatening. Sarah moved to the door, rifle held low but ready, and opened it just as the stranger reached the bottom step. "Good morning, ma'am," he called, removing his hat to reveal neatly trimmed dark hair graying at the temples. His smile was practiced, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. "Clayton Bennett at your service. Hope we're not intruding after such fierce weather." Sarah remained in the doorway, one hand on the rifle, the other on the doorframe. "What brings you to my property, Mr. Bennett?" His eyebrows rose slightly at her direct approach. "Your property? I understood this homestead belonged to James Caldwell." The casual mention of her husband's name sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the winter air. "I'm Sarah Caldwell, James's wife. This is our home." Bennett's smile broadened, though his eyes remained calculating. "Ah, Mrs. Caldwell, delighted to make your acquaintance. Your husband and I had some business matters to discuss. Is he available?" The careful phrasing, the present tense, the assumption of James's presence, told Sarah everything she needed to know. This man hadn't heard about James's disappearance, which meant either James hadn't reached Blackridge at all, or he had deliberately kept his departure secret. "My husband isn't here," she said carefully. "He left for Blackridge nearly 5 weeks ago for supplies and hasn't returned." Something flickered in Bennett's expression. Not surprise, but confirmation, as if she'd provided exactly the information he expected. "I see. Most unfortunate timing. The weather has been treacherous, of course. Perhaps he sought shelter elsewhere." "Perhaps," Sarah agreed neutrally, though they both recognized the hollow probability of that explanation after so much time. Bennett glanced past her into the cabin, his gaze shrewd and assessing. "You seem to be managing remarkably well for a woman alone with children, is it, in such challenging conditions?" The implied question hung in the air between them. Sarah chose her words carefully. "God provides, Mr. Bennett, sometimes in unexpected ways." "Indeed he does," Bennett replied, smoothly. "Nevertheless, I imagine you must be concerned about your situation. A widow, forgive me, a potentially widowed woman, alone on an isolated homestead with winter not yet half over." He sighed with theatrical sympathy. "It presents certain difficulties." "I'm managing quite well," Sarah said firmly, bristling at his presumption. "Now, if you'll excuse me, my children need attention." Bennett held up a placating hand. Of course. But before you go, perhaps I might explain the nature of my business with your husband. It could prove relevant to your circumstances." Against her better judgment, Sarah nodded for him to continue. "I represent the Northwestern Pacific Railroad Company," Bennett explained, his voice taking on a practiced cadence. "We're expanding our line through this territory come spring. Your husband and I had been in preliminary discussions regarding the purchase of this land. It's ideally situated for our planned route." Sarah frowned, confusion momentarily overriding caution. "Purchase? James never mentioned selling our homestead." Bennett's smile turned sympathetic. "I imagine he wanted to surprise you with the good news once negotiations were complete. We were prepared to offer a very generous sum, enough to establish your family quite comfortably in a more civilized area." The implication was clear. James had been planning to sell without consulting her. Given what she knew of her husband's character, Sarah couldn't dismiss the possibility entirely, but something about Bennett's too smooth manner raised her suspicions. "Do you have any documentation of these discussions?" she asked, her teacher's instinct for detecting falsehoods coming to the fore. Bennett's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nothing signed, of course. We were still in preliminary talks, but your husband seemed quite enthusiastic about the prospect, especially considering the financial pressures of supporting a growing family." Before Sarah could respond, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught her attention. Nahuel had emerged from the tree line, walking purposefully toward the cabin. His posture was relaxed but alert, eyes fixed on the unexpected visitors. Bennett followed her gaze, his expression darkening as he took in Nahuel's approach. "I see you have company after all," he remarked, all pretense of geniality evaporating. "An Indian. How unexpected." "Mr. Rivers is a friend," Sarah said firmly. "He's been helping me maintain the property during my husband's absence." Bennett's mouth curved in a smirk that made Sarah's skin crawl. "A friend, of course. Well, that explains how you've managed so admirably alone." He replaced his hat with deliberate slowness. "Though I wonder what the good citizens of Black Ridge would make of such an arrangement." The thinly veiled threat was unmistakable. Sarah's grip tightened on the rifle. "Mr. Bennett, I think you should state your actual business clearly, or be on your way. I have no interest in innuendo or veiled accusations." By now, Nahuel had drawn, close enough to hear their exchange. He positioned himself a few yards to the side, not interfering but making his presence known. The two men on horseback shifted uneasily, hands moving closer to their weapons. Bennett assessed the situation with cold calculation, evidently deciding that direct confrontation was not in his immediate interest. "Very well, Mrs. Caldwell. I'll speak plainly. Your husband signed a preliminary agreement to sell this property to the railroad. He accepted an advance payment of $200 to secure the deal." Sarah's shock must have shown on her face because Bennett continued with renewed confidence. "I see this comes as news to you. Nevertheless, it's a binding arrangement. The full purchase will be completed in spring, at which time you'll be expected to vacate the premises." "That's impossible," Sarah protested, though doubt crept into her mind. $200 would explain how James had funded his drinking and gambling in Black Ridge for months despite their failing farm. "My husband wouldn't sell our home without telling me." "Wouldn't he?" Bennett asked softly, his eyes knowing. "You seem like an intelligent woman, Mrs. Caldwell. Surely you've recognized by now that your husband possessed certain weaknesses of character." The casual cruelty of the observation struck Sarah like a physical blow. Before she could recover, Nahuel spoke for the first time, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Where is this agreement?" he asked simply. Bennett turned to him with barely concealed disdain. "I don't believe I'm obligated to answer questions from the agreement," Nahuel interrupted, his tone unchanged, but somehow carrying greater authority. "If it exists, produce it." Bennett's face flushed with anger. "It's at my office in Black Ridge. I didn't anticipate needing documentation for a simple courtesy call." "Convenient," Nahuel observed mildly. Bennett's composure slipped further. "I don't know what game you're playing here, but this property is under contract to the Northwestern Pacific Railroad. If Mrs. Caldwell has allowed you to believe otherwise, She's been dishonest with you. Sarah stepped forward, anger displacing her earlier uncertainty. That's enough, Mr. Bennett. I have no knowledge of any agreement between my husband and your company. Until you produce legitimate documentation, I consider this matter closed, and your presence here unwelcome. Bennett's expression hardened into something ugly and determined. This isn't over, Mrs. Caldwell. Far from it. He gestured to his men. Mason, Parker, make note of the improvements to the property since our last visit. We'll want a complete inventory for the legal proceedings. The implied threat hung in the air as Bennett mounted his horse with practiced ease. I'll return. In 1 week with the necessary documentation, he announced. I suggest you use that time to consider your situation realistically. A woman alone or with questionable companionship has few rights on the frontier. The courts tend to favor progress and civilization over alternative arrangements. With that parting shot, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following close behind. Sarah and Nahuel stood in silence until the riders disappeared over the southern ridge. He's lying, Sarah said finally, though uncertainty colored her voice. James wouldn't have sold our home without telling me. Nahuel's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held sympathy. Men like your husband sometimes make choices without thinking of consequences. Even so, Sarah insisted, a legal sale would require my signature as well. The land grant is in both our names. Hope flickered in Nahuel's face. You're certain of this? Sarah nodded firmly. Absolutely. My father insisted on it before we left Philadelphia. He didn't entirely trust James's business sense, so he made sure I was equally named on all legal documents. Nahuel considered this information carefully. Bennett will return, he said finally, with documents, real or false. False, Sarah asserted, her confidence growing. James may have taken money from him, may have promised things he had no right to promise, but he couldn't legally sell this property without me. Railroad companies have power, Nahuel warned. Money, lawyers, government connections. Sarah's shoulders straightened with resolve, born of necessity. Then we'll need proof of our own. The original land grant is in the deed box under the floorboards. James wouldn't have taken it. He was too careless about such things. Together, they moved into the cabin, Nahuel keeping watch through the window while Sarah located the loose floorboard beneath the bed. She extracted a small metal box, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside lay several documents, carefully preserved despite the cabin's persistent dampness. Sarah rifled through them with growing relief, finally extracting a large parchment with official seals and signatures. Here it is, she breathed, spreading the document on the table. The original homestead claim, signed by both James and myself, officially registered with the Territorial Land Office. Nahuel studied the paper carefully, his expression grave. This helps, he acknowledged. But Bennett will have resources. We don't. What does he want with our land anyway? Sarah wondered, returning to the window to check on the babies, who had remained miraculously quiet throughout the confrontation. There must be easier properties to acquire for a railroad. Nahuel pointed to the crude map, included with the deed. Water, he said simply. Your creek doesn't freeze completely, even in winter. Year-round water sources are valuable for steam. Engines. So this isn't about a railroad route at all, Sarah realized. It's about access to the creek. Likely both, Nahuel corrected. But water makes your land worth fighting for. Sarah sank into a chair, the full implications of Bennett's visit washing over her. What do we do now? Nahuel's expression turned resolute. First, we prepare. Bennett will return, with men, probably more than today. We need to be ready. He glanced around the cabin, mentally cataloging their resources. Second, we need information. I'll ride to Eagle Crossing tomorrow, as planned. Trading postkeeper might know more about Bennett, about the railroad's real plans. Sarah nodded, drawing strength from his methodical approach. And third, Nahuel said, meeting her eyes directly, we decide what we're fighting for. This land, a future here, or something else entirely? The question hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to fully address. Sarah looked around the small cabin that had been first her prison, then her shelter, and now, unexpectedly, felt like a home worth defending. We're fighting for our right to choose, she said finally. Not to have decisions made for us by men, like Bennett or James. Nahuel's expression softened, a rare smile transforming his features. Good answer, he said simply. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together at the table making plans by lamplight. Sarah catalogued their supplies and resources while Nahuel sketched a rough map of the property, marking defensible positions and vulnerabilities. If Bennett returns with force, we need high ground, he explained, indicating a rocky outcropping near the creek. Clear sightlines. Warning system. Sarah watched his hands move across the paper, strong, capable hands that had mended her roof, cared for her children, and now planned to defend her home. Why are you doing this? She asked suddenly. You could leave. This isn't your fight. Nahuel looked up, his dark eyes serious in the lamplight. Told you before. We shared a fire. Now we share a purpose. But your life, your plans, Sarah persisted. You're risking everything for a widow and 4 children who aren't your responsibility. Nahuel was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. 6 years I've wandered, he said finally. 6 years since Kimmy died, moving always, belonging nowhere. His eyes met hers directly. Here, now, I have purpose again, worth any risk. The simple honesty of his declaration silenced any further questions. Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering his, not in gratitude this time, but in solidarity. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the moon rose, over the snow-covered landscape, casting long shadows across the clearing. In Black Ridge, Clayton Bennett gathered his allies and resources, planning his next move. And somewhere between, on the frozen trail that connected civilization to wilderness, the truth about James Caldwell's fate waited to be discovered. The conflict was just beginning, but for the first time since arriving on the frontier, Sarah felt equal to the challenge, not because she was stronger or wiser than before, but because she was no longer facing the wilderness alone. The morning after Bennett's unwelcome visit dawned clear and cold. The sky, an impossible blue, stretched taut over the snowy landscape. Sarah rose early, moving quietly around the cabin to avoid waking the children who had miraculously all slept through the night for the first time since their illnesses began. Nahuel was already gone, his bedroll neatly folded by the door, the only indication that he had slept there at all. Through the window, Sarah could see him by the barn, preparing his horse for the journey to Eagle Crossing. The animal was saddled lightly, with only essential supplies, a configuration designed for speed rather than comfort. Sarah quickly prepared coffee and a simple breakfast of cornbread and dried apple slices, wrapping portions to take outside. She pulled on her coat, newly lined with rabbit fur that Nahuel had provided, and stepped into the crystalline morning. "You're leaving already?" she asked, approaching with the wrapped food extended like an offering. Nahuel secured a final strap on his saddle before turning to her. "Early start means returning sooner," he explained, accepting the package with a nod of thanks. "Should reach Eagle Crossing by midday if the trail is passable." Sarah nodded, understanding the logic, but unable to quell the uneasiness that had settled in her stomach since Bennett's departure. "Be careful," she said, echoing words she'd spoken before. Though they carried more weight now, the danger had shown itself to be human rather than elemental. "Always am," he replied, the familiar response somehow reassuring in its consistency. Sarah hesitated, then withdrew a folded paper from her pocket. "I made a list of what we need most," And, she paused, I added a note to send to the territorial marshal in Fort Benton about Bennett's claims and about James. Nahuel took the paper, reading her neat handwriting with careful attention. Good thinking, he said, a hint of approval warming his tone. Law should know what's happening here, even if they're too far away to help quickly. I included funds for the telegram, Sarah added, pressing a small coin purse into his hand. It's not much, just what I had hidden away for emergencies, but it should cover the cost. Nahuel's brow furrowed as he weighed the purse. Where did you— I wasn't always naive about James, Sarah interrupted, a rueful smile touching her lips. I kept a little aside from each supply run, just in case. The admission felt like confessing a betrayal, though experience had proven her caution justified. Nahuel nodded, understanding without judgment. Smart woman, he said simply, tucking both letter and purse into his inner pocket. I'll return by tomorrow night. 3 trade posts between here and Eagle Crossing. I'll check each for news of your husband. The mention of James hung between them, a complicated shadow neither could fully address. Sarah had not spoken his name aloud in days, and when Nahuel did, it felt like invoking a ghost, one whose presence grew fainter with each passing day. What should I do while you're gone? Sarah asked, deliberately changing the subject. About Bennett, I mean. Stay vigilant but not afraid, Nahuel advised. Keep the rifle loaded but out of sight. If anyone comes, speak through the door first. Don't open it unless you're certain it's safe. He paused, considering, and prepare as we discussed, just in case. The night before, they had mapped out contingency plans, marking escape routes, identifying hiding places, calculating what supplies could be quickly gathered if they needed to abandon the cabin temporarily. The calm, methodical way Nahuel had approached these preparations had simultaneously terrified and reassured Sarah. He clearly believed the threat from Bennett was real, but also believed they could withstand it. I will, she promised. The children and I will be ready for whatever comes. Something shifted in Nahuel's expression at her words, a softening around his eyes, a faint curve of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile but conveyed appreciation nonetheless. I know, he said. He mounted his horse with fluid grace, settling into the saddle as if born to it. For a moment, he looked every inch the cavalry scout he had once been, alert, capable, formidable. Then he nodded once in farewell and turned the horse eastward, setting off at a steady pace that would eat up the miles to Eagle Crossing without overtaxing his mount. Sarah watched until he disappeared around the bend in the trail, her hand raised in a half-wave he never saw. Only when he was completely gone from sight did she acknowledge the hollow feeling in her chest, not fear for her safety, but a more personal absence. In mere weeks, Nahuel rivers had become essential to her world in ways that transcended practical survival. With a deep breath, she turned back to the cabin, mentally listing the tasks ahead. There was water to haul, mending to complete, children to feed, and defenses to prepare. No time for idle reflection or complicated emotions. Inside, she found the twins awake, Emma and Levi babbling to each other in their private language of coos and gurgles. At 10 months, they were becoming increasingly aware of their surroundings, their personalities emerging more distinctly each day. Levi, fully recovered from his brush with scarlet fever, reached for her with chubby arms as she approached. Good morning, little ones, Sarah said, lifting him from the cradle. Did you sleep well? Are you ready for a grand adventure today? Emma responded with an enthusiastic squeal, waving her tiny fists in agreement. Sarah laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine mirth. When had laughter returned to this cabin? When had joy become possible again? The younger twins still slept, their tiny faces peaceful in repose. At just 2 months, Sophie and Daniel, remained more fragile than their older siblings, though both had gained weight steadily since Nahuel's arrival brought proper nutrition and warmth to their world. "Today," Sarah announced to her audience of two, "we're going to be very brave and very clever. We're going to make this cabin safe and sound, just like Mr. Rivers showed us." She set about her morning routine with renewed purpose, feeding and changing the children with efficient tenderness before placing them on a quilt near the hearth with their wooden toys. Then she turned her attention to the cabin itself, seeing it through new eyes, not as a prison of isolation, but as a fortress to be defended. Following Nahuel's suggestions, she moved the heavy trunk to reinforce the door from within. She cleared sightlines to each window, ensuring she could observe approaches from all directions. She gathered essential supplies, food, water, medicine, warm clothing, into a single pack that could be grabbed quickly if necessary. The physical labor felt good, purposeful, a tangible response to the nebulous threat Bennett represented. As she worked, Sarah found her mind wandering to places long avoided, recalling the capable, independent woman she had been before marriage. Turned her into a frontier wife and motherhood, into a desperate struggle for survival. In Philadelphia, she had managed a classroom of 30 children with firm confidence. She had navigated the politics of the school board with diplomatic skill. She had fended off unwanted suitors with polite but unmistakable clarity. That woman, educated, articulate, self-reliant, had seemed to disappear in the harsh realities of homestead life buried beneath exhaustion and James's increasingly domineering presence. Now, as she systematically prepared the cabin for potential conflict, Sarah felt her old self re-emerging, not unchanged, but strengthened by adversity, tempered like steel in fire. By midday, all 4 children were awake and fed, the cabin was organized for maximum security, and Sarah had moved on to her next task, inventorying their weapons. The rifle was cleaned and loaded with additional ammunition readily accessible. The hatchet used for splitting kindling was sharpened to a wicked edge. Kitchen knives were arranged for easy reach. "We won't need any of this," she told the babies as she worked. "Mr. Bennett will see our documentation and realize his mistake, or perhaps he won't return at all, but we'll be ready, just in case." Her voice remained steady, almost cheerful, belying the gravity of her preparations. The children responded to her tone rather than her words, remaining contented and playful on their quilt island. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, Sarah allowed herself a moment of rest. She sat in the rocking chair Nahuel had repaired, cradling Sophie, while the other 3 napped. The cabin was quiet, save for the gentle creaking of the chair runners and the baby's soft breathing against her neck. "What would your grandparents think of all this?" she whispered to the sleeping infant. Their Philadelphia daughter, prepared to defend a Montana homestead with a rifle and hatchet. The image was so incongruous that Sarah nearly laughed again, though the underlying gravity prevented it from becoming truly humorous. Her father had been a principled man, conservative in his politics, but progressive in his belief that women deserved education and economic opportunity. He had insisted Sarah learn to manage household accounts, understand basic legal concepts, and read financial news, skills that had seemed superfluous to a schoolteacher but now proved invaluable to a homesteader. He would be proud, she decided, speaking her thoughts aloud to the drowsing child. Not of the circumstances, perhaps, but of our resilience, of our refusal to surrender what is rightfully ours. The declaration, though spoken to an unhearing infant, resonated within Sarah with surprising force. Yes, her father would be proud, and more importantly, she was proud of herself, of the strength she had found in the depths of despair, of the mother she had become to 4 dependent lives, of the woman who was emerging from the ashes of her former self. As evening approached, Sarah lit the lamps and stoked the fire higher, creating a welcoming warmth that belied the strategic positioning of each piece of furniture. The cabin that had once felt like a trap now felt like a sanctuary, not because its physical attributes had changed significantly, but because her perception of it had transformed. She fed the children their evening meal, a nourishing porridge, enriched with precious milk, then bathed each one using water warmed on the stove. These domestic rituals, once performed in exhausted haste, now felt almost sacred, affirmations of normality in the face of uncertainty. As she tucked the babies into their beds for the night, a sound outside caught her attention. Not horses or men, but the distinctive howl of a wolf, answered moments later by another, more distant call. Sarah moved to the window, peering into the gathering darkness. The wolves rarely ventured so close to human habitation, but the harsh winter had driven game from the higher elevations, disrupting normal patterns. She could just make out a shadowy form at the forest's edge, a lean silhouette against the snow, watching the cabin with ancient, impassive eyes. "We're both survivors," she murmured to the unseen predator, "both adapting to circumstances beyond our control." The wolf's howl came again, haunting and primeval. Sarah felt a strange kinship with the creature, territorial, protective, determined. She watched until the shadow melted back into the trees, then secured the shutters against the night. Alone with sleeping children and her thoughts, Sarah found the evening strangely peaceful, despite the uncertainties that hung over them. She took advantage of the quiet to write in the journal she had recently rediscovered, recording not just events, but her reflections on them, creating a chronicle that her children might someday read and understand. She wrote of Bennett's visit and their preparations. She wrote of Nahwil's journey to Eagle Crossing and the plans they had made together, and most difficult of all, she wrote of James, not the charming suitor or the disappointing husband, but the complicated, flawed man she had chosen and the father her children would likely never know. "I believe now that he will not return," she wrote, the words painful but necessary. "Whether by choice or fate, he has departed our lives. I have moved through grief to acceptance and now face the future without the weight of false hope." Committing these thoughts to paper felt like releasing a burden she had carried for too long. The pretense that James's absence was temporary, that their family might someday be whole in the way she had once envisioned. The reality was both simpler and more complex. She was effectively a widow with 4 children, a woman alone on the frontier, except she wasn't truly alone anymore. Nahwel's presence in their lives defied easy categorization. He was neither servant nor savior, neither guest nor family, yet he had become essential in ways that transcended practical assistance. Sarah closed her journal without attempting to define what he meant to her, what future they might share. Some truths were still too tender for examination, even in private reflection. She slept fitfully that night, waking at every creak of the settling cabin, every gust of wind against the walls. Without Nahwel's solid presence near the door, the darkness seemed more profound, the wilderness beyond more threatening. Yet with each moment of anxiety came a counterbalancing resolve, a determination that transcended fear. Morning arrived, with no disturbances more significant than a fox's bark and the distant cry of a hunting owl. Sarah rose with the dawn, her body tired but her mind clear. Another day of waiting, watching, preparing. She had just finished feeding the younger twins when a new sound reached her, horses approaching from the east, moving at a steady trot. Not Bennett, she realized with relief. He would come from the south, from Black Ridge. This approach came from the direction of Eagle Crossing, Nahwel returning early? Possible, but unlikely given the distances involved. Neighbors checking after the storm? Few lived close enough to make the journey casually. Sarah positioned herself by the window, rifle within reach but not in hand. Through the glass, She could make out two riders cresting the eastern rise, a man and a woman, both bundled against the cold, leading a pack mule laden with supplies. As they drew closer, details emerged. The woman was older, grey-haired, and solidly built, riding with the easy confidence of long experience. The man was younger, perhaps in his 30s, with a distinctive red beard visible beneath his hat brim. Neither matched any of Sarah's neighbors that she could recall. They reined in a respectful distance from the cabin, the woman raising a hand in greeting rather than approaching immediately, a frontier courtesy that acknowledged the wariness of isolated homesteaders. "Hello, the cabin," the woman called, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. "Mrs. Caldwell, Sarah Caldwell." Sarah's pulse quickened. They knew her name specifically, which suggested purpose rather than casual visiting. "Who's asking?" she called back, her hand moving closer to the rifle. "Martha Jenkins, midwife from Beaver Creek," the woman replied. "And my son Timothy Nahwell Rivers sent us. Said you might need some looking after while he's detained in Eagle Crossing." The midwife! Sarah's tension eased slightly, though caution remained. Mrs. Jenkins had delivered all 4 of her children, riding miles through difficult conditions, each time. But her home lay nearly 10 miles downriver, a significant journey, especially in winter conditions. "What's detained Nahwell?" Sarah asked, still assessing the situation before committing to hospitality. Mrs. Jenkins exchanged a glance with her son before answering. "Better discussed inside, if you're willing, Mrs. Caldwell. It's news that shouldn't be shouted across snow." Something in the older woman's tone, grave but not alarming, convinced Sarah of their genuine connection to Nahwell. She nodded and stepped back from the window. "Please come in," she called. "You're welcome at our fire." As the visitors dismounted and secured their horses, Sarah quickly checked on the children, straightened her appearance, and positioned herself near the door, welcoming but watchful. Whatever news Mrs. Jenkins carried from Eagle Crossing, Sarah sensed it would alter their situation significantly. The knock came moments later, polite but firm. Sarah opened the door to find Martha Jenkins on the threshold, her weathered face kind but serious beneath her woolen hat. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said warmly, stepping inside with a rustle of heavy skirts. "It's good to see you looking so well. Last time I was here I feared we might lose you along with the little ones." "Mrs. Jenkins," Sarah acknowledged, accepting the older woman's brief embrace. "Your skill is the reason we all survived. Please come warm yourself." As Timothy followed his mother inside, bringing with him the scent of cold air and horses, Sarah noticed he carried a leather portfolio tucked securely beneath his arm. Something official, something important. "You mentioned Nahwell sent you," Sarah prompted, once initial pleasantries were exchanged and coffee offered. "Is he well? What happened to delay him?" Mrs. Jenkins warmed her hands around her coffee cup before answering. "He's well enough, though working harder than a man should. Asked us to bring you supplies and news while he completes his business." She glanced at her son, who nodded encouragement. "There's much to tell you, Mrs. Caldwell, about your husband, about Clayton Bennett, and about what awaits you all when spring comes." Sarah steeled herself, recognizing the gravity in the older woman's tone. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please tell me everything." As Mrs. Jenkins began to speak, Sarah understood that whatever transformation had begun within her, whatever healing had started in the crucible of survival, was about to accelerate. The world beyond their snowbound sanctuary was reaching in, bringing truths that could no longer be deferred. For better or worse, the time for waiting was over. The time for choices had arrived. Martha Jenkins settled deeper into her chair, her weathered hands cradling the steaming coffee mug, as if drawing strength from its warmth. Outside, her son Timothy tended to the horses and unloaded supplies, giving the women privacy for the conversation ahead. "First," the midwife began, her eyes compassionate but direct. "I should tell you what Nahuel discovered about your husband." Sarah sat very still, her posture betraying neither anxiety nor expectation. Whatever news arrived, she had prepared herself to receive it with dignity. "James Caldwell never reached Black Ridge during that last snowstorm," Mrs. Jenkins continued. "Or if he did, no one admits to seeing him. Nahuel checked every establishment, the general store, the saloon, even the jail." She paused, weighing her next words carefully. "3 days ago, a trapper found a horse half buried in snow about 5 miles south of here. Bay gelding with a white star, saddlebag still attached." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. The description matched their last horse perfectly, the one James had ridden away on that final morning. "And James?" she asked, opening her eyes to face whatever truth came next. "No sign yet," Mrs. Jenkins replied gently. "With the snow as deep as it's been, it may be spring before." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Sarah nodded, accepting the confirmation of what she had already come to believe. James was gone, likely thrown from his horse during the blizzard, disoriented, overcome by cold. A common enough fate on the frontier, yet still a tragedy. Despite everything, she felt a pang of genuine sorrow, not for the man he had become, but for the man he might have been. "I suspected as much," she said quietly. "Thank you for telling me directly." Mrs. Jenkins reached across to pat her hand. "You've shown remarkable strength, my dear. Not many women could have survived what you have, alone with 4 infants in the dead of winter." "I wasn't alone for long," Sarah reminded her, a hint of warmth entering her voice. "Nahuel found us just in time." "Yes," the older woman agreed, a knowing look crossing her face. "Providence works in mysterious ways." She straightened, her manner becoming more businesslike. "Now, about Clayton Bennett. That's a more complicated matter, and the real reason Nahuel sent us ahead." Sarah tensed involuntarily at the railroad man's name. "Has he been causing trouble in Eagle Crossing too?" "Bennett's been causing trouble throughout the territory," Mrs. Jenkins confirmed. "But in this case, it's what Nahuel uncovered about him that's significant." She leaned forward, lowering her voice despite their privacy. "He's not with the Northwestern Pacific Railroad at all, at least not officially." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "Then who?" "He represents a group of investors speculating on land ahead of the railroad's planned route," Mrs. Jenkins explained. "They buy cheap from desperate homesteaders, then sell high to the actual railroad companies once the routes are confirmed. So his claim about James selling our land could be partly true," the midwife acknowledged. "James might have taken money from Bennett, might have signed something, but as you suspected, without your signature, no legitimate sale could be completed." Relief washed through Sarah, though it was tempered by wariness. "Bennett doesn't strike me as a man who accepts legal obstacles easily." "He isn't," Mrs. Jenkins agreed grimly. "Which is why Nahuel stayed behind in Eagle Crossing. He's arranging protections, legal and otherwise." Before Sarah could question this cryptic statement, the cabin door opened, admitting Timothy Jenkins along with a blast of cold air. The young man stomped snow from his boots, his expression apologetic for interrupting. "Supplies are unloaded, Ma," he reported, closing the door securely behind him. "Got everything on Mr. Rivers' list, plus some extra preserves, Mrs. Mitchell." "Sent over?" "Thank you, Timothy," his mother acknowledged. "Did you bring in the documents as well?" "Right here," he confirmed, producing the leather portfolio Sarah had noticed earlier. He approached the table, untying the folder's strings with careful precision. "What's all this?" Sarah asked, eyeing the collection of papers Timothy began. Arranging before her, Mrs. Jenkins' expression softened with something like pride. "This, my dear, is your future, if you choose to claim it." Timothy cleared his throat, assuming a more formal demeanor. Mrs. Caldwell, I should mention that in addition to helping my mother with her midwifery, I serve as notary public for Beaver Creek and surrounding homesteads. Mr. Rivers asked me to prepare several legal documents for your consideration." Sarah studied the young man with new appreciation. His manner was educated, his speech more refined than the typical frontier settler. "What sort of documents?" "First," he began, indicating a parchment bearing official seals, "a formal declaration of your husband's presumed death, which can be filed with the territorial authorities. Given the circumstances and the discovery of his horse, there's sufficient evidence for legal recognition of widowhood." Sarah nodded, understanding the practical necessity of this step, however emotionally complex. "Second," Timothy continued, "a reaffirmation of your homestead claim as sole owner, with updated boundaries, properly surveyed and recorded." He indicated a detailed map attached to another document. Mr. Rivers was quite insistent that the creek and northwestern ridge be specifically included in the legal description. "The creek is what Bennett wants most," Sarah remembered aloud. "That's why he's so determined to claim this land." Mrs. Jenkins nodded. "Exactly. And with this document properly filed, his schemes have no legal standing. The land is yours alone now, free and clear." Sarah examined the map, noting how the property lines had been drawn to maximize the natural advantages of the terrain. "Nahuel did all this in just 2 days?" "He's quite persuasive when motivated," Mrs. Jenkins remarked with a small smile. "And he appears extremely motivated where your welfare is concerned." A warm flush rose to Sarah's cheeks at the gentle implication. "We've been through a great deal together in a short time," she said carefully. "Indeed," the midwife agreed, her expression knowing but kind. "Which brings us to the third document. This one is, well, more personal in nature." Timothy produced a final paper, this one bearing fewer official markings, but clearly written in careful legal language. "This is a proposal for a partnership agreement," he explained, his tone neutral and professional despite the document's unusual contents. "Partnership?" Sarah questioned, scanning the opening paragraph with growing curiosity. "Mr. Rivers proposes a formal business arrangement," Timothy elaborated. "He would contribute labor, protection, and his considerable skills in hunting and trading. You would contribute the land itself and your abilities in household management and child-rearing. Any profits from future farming, trapping, or other enterprises would be shared equally." Sarah looked up from the document, momentarily speechless. A business partnership was not what she had expected, though precisely what she had expected she couldn't have articulated. "It's an unusual arrangement," Mrs. Jenkins acknowledged, reading Sarah's surprise correctly. "But practical for the frontier, and respectable, which matters more than some might admit." "Respectable," Sarah repeated, testing the word and its implications. "A formal business partnership would give structure to Nahuel's continued presence, providing a framework that neighbors and officials could understand without scandal or speculation." "There's no obligation to sign immediately," Timothy assured. Mr. Rivers was adamant that you be given time to consider all options." "Options?" Sarah asked, sensing there was more to come. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her expression growing more serious. "That's the final matter we're to discuss. With James gone and your legal status clarified, you have choices that weren't available before." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There's a position open at the new territorial school in Fort Benton, teaching position with accommodations suitable for a widow with children." "A teaching position," Sarah echoed, her former profession, suddenly presented as a viable future once more. "But Fort Benton is nearly 100 miles from here." "It is," Mrs. Jenkins confirmed, "far from this isolated homestead. Close to civilization, medical care, educational opportunities for your children as they grow." She let the contrast settle before continuing. Nahuel wanted you to know all possibilities before making any decisions about your future here. Understanding dawned slowly as Sarah absorbed the full meaning behind these meticulously prepared documents and options. Nahuel had done more than secure her legal position. He had ensured her complete freedom to choose her own path forward, whether that path included him or not. "He's giving me a choice," she said softly, almost to herself. "A real choice, not an ultimatum or an obligation." Mrs. Jenkins smiled gently. "That man rode through 3 feet of snow and negotiated with territorial officials for hours to make certain you had options beyond mere survival." She reached for Sarah's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "He respects you enough to let you decide what happens next. That's rare in any man, much less one who clearly cares as deeply as he does." Sarah felt a wave of emotion rising within her, gratitude certainly, but something deeper and more complex as well. In all her adult life, no one had ever worked so diligently to secure her independence rather than diminish it. "When will he return?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds," Timothy answered. He had some final business with the trading post owner, something about securing regular deliveries regardless of who occupies this property. Again, Nahuel's thorough consideration for her well-being, regardless of her decision about their future connection. Sarah rose from the table, needing movement to process the swirl of emotions and possibilities suddenly before her. "I need time to think," she said, moving to check on the children, who had remained remarkably content throughout the long conversation. "Of course," Mrs. Jenkins agreed. "Timothy and I will stay the night if that's acceptable. The journey back to Beaver Creek is too far to attempt before dark." "Please do," Sarah welcomed, grateful for the company and the chance to discuss matters further as she processed her thoughts. "There's plenty of room, and the children would benefit from your experienced eye." The remainder of the day passed. In practical activities, Mrs. Jenkins examining each child thoroughly and pronouncing them remarkably healthy given their earlier illnesses. Timothy reinforcing Nahuel's repairs to the roof and north wall. Sarah inventorying the new supplies and preparing a hearty meal for her guests. Yet beneath these ordinary tasks ran a current of anticipation, a sense that life stood balanced on the edge of profound change, awaiting only her decision to determine which direction it would flow. That night, after her guests had retired to the small lean-to Nahuel had prepared as a guest space, Sarah sat alone by the fire. The 3 documents spread before her like a crossroads, made manifest in paper, and the declaration of widowhood offered closure, legal recognition of a truth her heart had already accepted. The homestead reaffirmation secured her claim to this land that had nearly broken her, but now represented hard-won independence. And the partnership proposal, Sarah traced the careful handwriting, recognizing it as Nahuel's, measured, precise, without flourish, but deeply intentional. Like the man himself, he had outlined practical arrangements with thorough consideration, addressing everything from seasonal activities to financial management. Yet beneath the pragmatic details lay an unspoken question, one too personal, too consequential to commit to legal language. Outside, the wind changed direction, bringing with it the clean scent of pine and approaching snow. Another storm was coming, though milder than its predecessors, if the subtle signs were to be believed. Sarah had learned to read these signals over the harsh months, had learned to interpret the language of wilderness just as she had once decoded the personalities of each student in her classroom. She had changed, fundamentally and irrevocably. The Sarah Caldwell, who had arrived on this homestead 2 years ago, educated but naive, determined but unprepared, no longer existed. In her place stood a woman tempered by hardship, strengthened by survival, capable of clear-eyed assessment rather than wishful thinking. What did this new Sarah want? The security of Fort Benton, with its established structures and familiar profession, or the challenging future of this remote homestead with all its dangers and possibilities? And Nahuel, what did she truly want from him? A business partner whose practical skills complemented her own, a protector for her vulnerable family, or something deeper, more personal, more frightening in its potential for both joy and heartbreak? What would you choose? She whispered to the sleeping children, knowing they could offer no guidance, but drawing comfort from their peaceful presence nonetheless. Each steady breath, each tiny movement in sleep, represented a miracle of survival she couldn't take for granted. She remembered them as they had been just weeks ago, feverish, failing, fading before her eyes. She remembered her own desperation, her certainty that death approached from all sides, and she remembered the moment everything changed, a knock at the door, a stranger's silhouette against the snow, a simple offer of help that altered the course of 5 lives. Some debts could never be repaid in kind. Some connections transcended ordinary measurement. What existed between her and Nahuel had been forged in extremity, tempered in shared purpose, and now stood ready to transform into... What? Sarah gathered the documents carefully, securing them in the metal deed box for safekeeping. Tomorrow would bring decisions, but tonight called for reflection, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to hope for more than mere survival. Dawn broke with pristine clarity, the sun transforming frost-laden trees into crystalline sculptures that caught and fractured light into rainbow fragments. Sarah rose early, completing her morning tasks with quiet efficiency while her guests still slept. The children, sensing her anticipatory mood, were unusually cooperative. Even Sophie, typically fussy at this hour, accepted her breakfast with minimal protest. By mid-morning, Mrs. Jenkins and Timothy had joined her in the cabin's main room, conversation flowing easily among them as they discussed practical matters, crop possibilities for spring planting, improvements for the barn, potential sources of income beyond basic subsistence farming. "You speak as if you've decided to stay," Mrs. Jenkins observed during a momentary lull, her tone neutral but her eyes keenly observant. Sarah paused in her mending, considering the older woman's perceptiveness. "I haven't decided anything officially," she replied carefully. "But this place, it's become more than just land or shelter. It represents something I'm not ready to surrender. Independence comes with a heavy price on the frontier," Mrs. Jenkins cautioned, though without judgment, "especially for a woman alone." "I'm aware," Sarah acknowledged. "But I'm not the same woman who arrived here full of romantic notions about pioneer life. I understand the challenges now, and my own capacity to meet them." A sound outside interrupted their conversation, the distinctive rhythm of hoofbeats approaching from the east. Sarah's pulse quickened as she moved to the window, recognizing immediately the rider's broad-shouldered silhouette and the distinctive gait of his Mustang. Nahuel had returned. He approached slowly, clearly tired from his journey but alert, his gaze sweeping the property with habitual vigilance before settling on the cabin. When Sarah appeared in the doorway, something in his expression shifted, a subtle softening that might have been imperceptible to anyone who hadn't learned to read the nuances of his carefully controlled demeanor. "Welcome back," she called. Stepping onto the porch despite the morning chill, Nahuel dismounted with fluid grace despite obvious fatigue, securing his horse to the hitching post before approaching. "Everything well here?" he asked, his deep voice carrying easily across the remaining distance. "Very well," Sarah confirmed. "Mrs. Jenkins and Timothy have been excellent company, and the children are thriving." He nodded, satisfaction evident, in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. "Bennett? No sign of him," Sarah reported, "though we've remained watchful." Nahuel reached the porch steps, pausing at the bottom, as if uncertain of his welcome after the revelations his messengers had delivered. "You received the documents?" "I did," Sarah replied, studying his face, the strong planes and angles now familiar, the dark eyes that revealed more than he perhaps intended. "Thank you for everything you've done, for all the choices you've secured for me." Something flickered in his expression, a vulnerability at odds with his capable presence. "Choices are important," he said simply, "for both of us." The quiet statement confirmed what Sarah had suspected, that the carefully outlined partnership proposal represented more than practical arrangements. It offered a framework within which something deeper might grow, if both parties chose it. "I've been thinking about those choices," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the significance of the moment. "About Fort Benton and teaching, about this homestead and what it could become." Nahuel waited, his stillness absolute, a man accustomed to patience, to letting events unfold at their natural pace. "I want to stay," Sarah continued, her decision crystallizing into certainty as she spoke it aloud. "Not because I'm afraid to leave or unable to manage elsewhere, but because I choose this place, this life." She paused, gathering courage for the most difficult part. This partnership. The final word hung between them, its multiple meanings, acknowledged but not yet fully defined. Nahuel's expression remained carefully neutral, though something kindled in his eyes. "The partnership proposal is sound," he said carefully. "Fair terms for both parties." "The terms are fair," Sarah agreed, taking a step closer, "but incomplete." Nahuel's brow furrowed slightly, the only indication of his uncertainty. "What's missing?" Sarah smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face from merely pretty to luminous. "The document outlines what we'll share. Labor, resources, responsibilities. But not why we're sharing them." Understanding dawned in Nahuel's eyes, along with a wariness born of past loss. "Why matters," he acknowledged softly. "It does," Sarah affirmed. "And my why isn't just practical survival anymore. It's because in the darkest moment of my life, you brought light. Because you see me as I am, not as someone to be protected or controlled, but as an equal, worthy of respect." She took another step closer, close enough now that she had to tilt her head to maintain eye contact. "Because even in the midst of crisis and uncertainty, I've found something with you that I never expected to find again. Hope, trust, connection." Nahuel's composure wavered, raw emotion briefly visible before he mastered it. "Sarah," he said, her name almost a reverence on his lips. "I can't promise an easy life. I carry shadows." "We all do," she replied simply. "I'm not asking for perfection, just honesty. Partnership in truth as well as name." For a long moment he stood silent, weighing her words and his response with characteristic care. Then, with deliberate intent, he climbed the remaining steps to stand before her, close enough that the cloud of his breath mingled with hers in the cold air. "I stayed that first night because you needed help," he said, his deep voice pitched low for her ears alone. "I returned because the children needed protection. I built defenses because the homestead needed securing." His hand rose slowly, fingers barely brushing her cheek in a touch so gentle it might have been imagined. "But I'm here now because you've become my home. Not this cabin, not this land. You." The simple declaration, unembellished but profound, was more affecting than any elaborate profession could have been. Sarah leaned into his touch, her own hand rising to cover his, anchoring it against her skin. "Then let's build something worthy of that truth," she whispered, "together." Inside the cabin, a baby's cry broke the moment, Sophie demanding attention with her characteristic impatience. Sarah laughed softly, the sound bright with genuine happiness. "All 5 of us together," she amended. Nahuel's rare smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude and grief. "All 5, he agreed, his free hand reaching for hers in a gesture more binding than any signed document could be. As they turned toward the cabin door, toward the children who waited within, toward Mrs. Jenkins, who watched with knowing approval, toward the future they would forge through choice rather than circumstance, the sun broke fully through the morning clouds, illuminating the homestead with golden promise. Winter still blanketed the Montana territory, and challenges undoubtedly waited ahead. Bennett's schemes, territorial politics, the inherent difficulties of frontier life. But for the first time, Sarah faced these prospects, not with dread or resignation, but with confident anticipation. The destitute widow and her 4 babies, once left to die in winter's cruel embrace, had found not just survival, but renewal. And the lone tracker, who had once wandered without purpose, had discovered that the greatest journey of all led not through wilderness, but through the human heart's capacity for healing and hope. Together, they stepped across the threshold, not into happily ever after, but into the far more valuable reality of a life chosen with clear eyes and full hearts. Into a home defined not by walls and boundaries, but by the love sheltered within. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.